welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, and our special guest author, a good friend, and a host here on EWTN, Joseph Pearce. This time, Heroes of the Catholic Reformation, Saints Who Renewed the Church, published by our friends at Our Sunday Visitor, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Always a pleasure to see you, Mr. Pearce.
Good to be back.
When you grace our space here at Bookmark, and of course, an author of 20-something books. And we were thinking also about how many years ago we first met in talking about that, about the time when The Lord of the Rings was coming out, etc. And Raymond had you on, and you were on one of our live shows. And of course, people will remember from the Heroes of the Catholic Reformation that you were on as well, not that long ago, but talking about somebody else from England, Tolkien,
yes,
and having to do with a particular program. Talk about that when you were on with Father Mitch back in the fall.
Yeah, we basically, I was on Father Mitch's show to discuss Discovering Tolkien, which was a film about the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Catholicism, shot largely in New Zealand on the locations of
all places, right?
Well, yeah, Peter Jackson's movies were shot there, of course.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful film, and I assume you'll be showing it again at some time on the network.
Definitely.
So, yeah, that was the last time I was here.
And it's certainly available through our EWTN Religious Catalog as a DVD or even a download or a rental these days. So we're getting into the new technology and keeping up with the times. But yeah, it was kind of funny when John Elson first brought the project to us and talked to us internally here. We kind of said, well, why are we going to New Zealand to shoot this? I know the movie was shot there, but shouldn't we be shooting? But it really has come together. And it really was a marriage of Tolkien's writing and an experience of young people experiencing, and again, the idea of reaching out to people in a methodology that a younger person can be attracted to.
I think it really, really showed the power of Tolkien, both the movies and the books, to reach new generations, that it's timeless.
Now, we've just come out of the year that was the 500th anniversary of the quote-unquote Reformation. And you talk about the heroes of the Catholic Reformation, saints who renewed the church. But you make a point at the beginning of this that there's more than one Reformation in people's minds. So you say there's actually three. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think it's very important to distinguish between the three Reformations. So the first chapter of the book, I think, is called the Three Reformations. There's the Protestant Reformation, and normally when we hear the word the Reformation, that's the Reformation we're thinking about. We think of Martin Luther and Calvin. But in England, we have the English Reformation, and that's very different from the Protestant Reformation. That's basically a secularist Reformation where the king, Henry VIII, as Caesar, declares himself head of the church. So Henry VIII was hostile to Protestantism, so it's not part of the Protestant Reformation, it's a separate English Reformation. Third and finally, and most importantly, and certainly most blessedly, we have the Catholic Reformation, which is the Catholic Church's response to those secular and theological threats.
And people would hear that as, and you allude to it as the Counter-Reformations kind of talked about. It's interesting too, because growing up as a kid in the 60s up until after Vatican II, and that explains why, but in the Catholic textbooks we used in grammar school, I never heard of the word Reformation. It was the Protestant revolt.
Yes.
And then obviously as a Vatican II and kind of ecumenism came about, and again, we've probably have greater relationships with our Protestant brothers and sisters today, at least many of them actually not coming out of ecumenical discussions ongoing forever, but quite honestly outside abortion clinics.
Right, exactly.
The pro-life movement.
Exactly. Well, I think the two things that have brought us together with our Protestant brothers and sisters is the pro-life movement and then the rise of a radical secularism, which is at war with Christianity and irrespective of what shade of Christianity it is.
Now, you say this book is about heroes. It's also a book about saints. And the question is, I'm assuming that every saint is a hero, but every hero is not a saint. Certainly, especially if you're talking about, as you talk about, people who in the secular world, like an Achilles or somebody else, might be seen as a hero in one sense.
Yeah, in the secular understanding of the word, heroes can be anti-heroes. We talk about Achilles, who had a fatal flaw, a tragic flaw. We can talk about people like Adolf Hitler. We can talk about, who was hero worshipped. Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe. I mean, so in other words, but from a Catholic's perspective, heroism and holiness are synonymous. Basically, to be a good Catholic is to grow in sanctity. In other words, to become a saint. So I want to make it perfectly clear that really a Catholic saint is a Catholic hero.
Well, it's interesting too because I'm thinking back when you were on with Father Mitch. It was I think it was All Saints Day actually when you were on, and the idea of Catholics remembering that though your focus here is on people who've been named a saint, that the Catholics believe, of course, like all Christians do, that everyone in heaven is quote unquote a saint.
Yes.
And so it really isn't just focused, even though this book might be, on those who are named. And in many ways, as you talk about in the book, there's many others who probably are in heaven as well, who participated in the Catholic, let's say, counter-Reformation of standing up for the faith, or those in England or in Germany or in other parts of Europe who fell prey to what was going on as far as the battles that were happening in the 30 Years' War, etc.
Basically, obviously, only a relatively few people are canonized. In other words, are placed in the canon of the saints. But there are, please God and thank God, thousands of unrecognized saints that are nonetheless in heaven and therefore are saints.
Right. You say here, in the following pages, we'll celebrate those who fought the dragons of sin and doctrinal error in the turbulent period of the 16th century. This was a time in which the bride of Christ was being assailed by the dragons of secularism, Islam, and heresy. You could say the same thing today, which is your point, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, one of the glories about studying history, it helps us to understand the lessons of the past and apply them to the present. And in fact, things aren't as different today as we sometimes think they are. Europe in the 1500s was being assailed by militant imperialistic Islam to the south, the Ottoman Empire, obviously the rupture of the Protestant Reformation, the secular fundamentalism of the English government. And corruption even within the Catholic countries. But in the midst of all that, we had this Catholic response, which included the golden age in terms of great saints.
Right. Now you say in chapter 1, and we go into that, as you indicated, the three Reformations, and you alluded to the political side by saying Henry VIII was not a Protestant, but a tyrant. So, and I think I understand from what you said earlier and what you say in the book what you mean by that, but most people would think, well, wasn't he protesting against the church?
No, he wasn't protesting against the church. He basically, he wrote a book called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments against Martin Luther. He was an enemy of Protestantism.
Did he write that book? Or
there are scholars argue about the extent to which he was the author, but certainly his name was appended to it with his approval. But no, basically, Henry VIII wanted to have power over the church. He wanted to have absolute power within his realm. In other words, he was taking upon himself as Caesar powers that were rightfully God's, and that's a secularist revolt against the church and not a theological revolt against the church.
Though there were other people in the background who, for political and in some cases theological reasons, use that opportunity.
What tends to happen, of course, once you stray away from the truth, you end up in bed with strange people.
Right.
So Henry VIII ended up certainly with some of his main advisors being Protestants, with whom he would have disapproved theologically, but they were allies politically.
And his daughter as well.
Yeah, indeed, and Elizabeth I.
Elizabeth. Now you talk about in the very beginning. We'll go through talk about the English martyrs. You've got Thomas More and John Fisher. Now everybody and they both got beheaded, and most people kind of know the Thomas More story, and you talk about Bolt's play, and you talk about the wonderful movies, including the Charlton Heston. I actually met Charlton Heston when he was shooting, when he had just finished that movie. It was the only time I met him. But you also talk about, which I thought was interesting, Wolf Hall, which was a very popular show on PBS in the last couple of years, which is kind of took Thomas More and flipped him on his head.
Yeah, and taking people like Thomas Cromwell, who are monsters, and making them heroes. I mean, basically, once you hate Catholicism enough, you'll make the demons the angels and the angels the demons, and that's basically what that show does.
Isn't that what we see happening all the time today?
It is. It's basically Orwellian doublethink. It's demonic. It's demonic.
Now, you also bring in here something that's dear to you, not only talking about the Jesuit martyrs, Edmund Campion and Robert Southwell?
Yeah.
Okay. I always mispronounce it. It looks like Southwell to an American, right? Martyred in 1581, 1595. But then you bring in an intriguing connection with William Shakespeare. So you had to bring that in, huh?
Of course. I mean, I obviously bring to the table that what I'm best at, and my previous work in the 1500s has been on William Shakespeare. And there are connections between Shakespeare and St. Thomas More, and Shakespeare and St. Edmund Campion, and Shakespeare and St. Robert Southwell. So it's natural for me to obviously look at the Shakespearean connection, so to speak.
Right. You also bring in one that maybe one the average person doesn't think of, Pope Pius V.
Yeah, a great favourite of mine, St. Pius V, very holy pope at a time when the church needed a good and holy pope. He lived a very austere life. He was personally holy in his lifestyle, but was courageous in raising the Holy League to defeat the Muslim fleet at the Battle of Lepanto, to send out missionaries to the far-flung corners of the world, to fight the heresies in the north, to condemn Elizabeth I for her butchery of her own people. Yeah, very courageous, very holy Pope.
Now, going back to England, you talk about the Tudors and the Stuart monarchies, and you call it a deformation, okay? And then you say another truer label for the Protestant English Reformations could be the rupture.
I think that's a much better word for it, because that's what it did. It ruptured England from the church, as the Protestant Reformation ruptured parts of the continental Europe from the church. And that rupture, of course, has caused great damage historically. You know, I personally, my ecclesiology is such that, you know, the church is the mystical body of Jesus Christ, and the church wasn't ruptured. Right. But what happened, these people ruptured themselves from the church. Right. And that's obviously a tragedy.
You say Protestantism is an explosion of faith, but not in the positive sense of the fruits of quote-unquote reform, but in the negative sense of a violent disintegration of one body of reformers under Luther into thousands of individual denominations.
Well, that's what we see. Basically, instead of one Lutheran denomination, we have tens of thousands of different Protestant sects, all with their own rather peculiar, understanding of the truth. It's become de facto relativism. Everybody makes up their own mind about what they want Jesus to be.
Right. Churches of the Reformation, you say, are becoming more eccentric, or in the language of the Catholic Reformation, more heretical. Only the rupture could have spawned the rapture.
Yes, I couldn't resist the play
on words.
So you had to
work
there.
on that one. Huh?
I had to work on that one. I couldn't resist the play on words. But it's true. I mean, the sort of bizarre theology behind the raptures could not have happened without the bizarre things preceding it.
Now, we were just talking a little bit about Tolkien before because of the program that you worked on. Might we not see the Reformation as a catastrophe through which God has worked his mystical will? And then you've got this word, and I'll let you pronounce it, that Tolkien invented a word to describe the good that God brings out of evil.
Yes, the word's eucatastrophe. Okay. So basically, eu is the Greek word for good. So it's the good that comes from a bad turn. So the crucifixion leads to the resurrection, for instance. We might, in that divine order of things, divine providence, see actually the Protestant Reformation, the English Reformation, as a bad thing that brought forth many beautiful fruits in response to it.
Now, it's interesting, too, because, again, we think about England. We talk about Thomas More, people know him. But John Fisher, he kind of gets tagged along this. Thomas More and John Fisher. And it's like, who is John Fisher? Who was he?
Well, he was actually a very saintly bishop of the church, a very learned man, a key figure at the universities. He taught actually Henry VIII when Henry VIII was a boy before he became king. And lived a very austere life, so a very simple life. Again, another, like St. Pius V, a holy man who had the courage of his convictions. And one of the shameful things about the 1530s in England was that he was the only bishop who had the courage to stand up in English hierarchy to the tyranny of Henry VIII. Right.
You say it would be Fisher's defense of Catherine of Aragon, the queen whom Henry had abandoned in order to pursue his adulterous relation with Anne Boleyn, which would cause his estrangement from the king, because he was tied into the family as well, even prior to that, like the king's mother, like Lady Margaret. And you say in 1530, John Fisher, along with two other bishops, appealed to Rome against the English Parliament's increasing usurpation of the rights of the church. Henry responded with issuing an edict making all appeals to Rome illegal.
Well, that's a perfect example, right? I mean, it's the language of the tyrant. It's the language of an Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. I will not accept any questioning of my absolute power. So to hell with Rome, basically. Right.
Now, you talk about the story of Shakespeare's involvement in the play Sir Thomas More. What is the play Sir Thomas More?
Well, there was a play that when Elizabeth I died, they tried to get past the censors, because there was a brief period when James I had promised that he was basically going to free the Catholics from persecution.
Right.
And I endeavour to show, and I've shown in other places at greater length than I do in this book, that I believe the evidence shows that Shakespeare is probably the primary author of that play. It's a very pro-Thomas More play. And the hope was now Elizabeth's dead, the truth can be revealed.
Right.
But it was still smothered, and actually it was under Queen Elizabeth II. In other words, only a few years ago that the play was finally first performed.
Right, and as you point out, I mean, this really went on until basically the Catholic Emancipation Act?
1829,
1829, so we're talking about a few hundred years.
Yeah.
Excuse me. What are gilded butterflies?
Gilded butterflies, that's actually a wonderful phrase from a speech that King Lear gives in Shakespeare's play. And it refers to courtiers who basically put worldliness and worldly fashions ahead of the church and their responsibilities. So this was Shakespeare showing his allegiance, if you like, to the saints as opposed to the people that Henry VIII surrounded himself with.
You have a section called The Passion of Fisher and Moore, and you say, although Henry had banished all thoughts of mercy towards those who had dared to defy him, he still needed to assuage the anger of the people of London, many of whom saw parallels between Fisher's treatment at the hands of the king and the treatment of John the Baptist at the hands of King Herod, both of whom obviously had their heads cut off.
Yeah, well, one thing we often forget when we're looking at the history of England in the 1500s is the majority of the English people remained Catholic. In other words, that the English Reformation was forced upon the English people by the king. It was a usurpation of power and a tyrant's defiance of the will of the people. So England was basically Catholic. So, of course, these Catholic martyrs were getting an awful lot of sympathy from the ordinary people, St. John Fisher,
Right.
St. Thomas More, etc.
Right, the great book, Stripping of the Altars, which demonstrated that it
Exactly.
wasn't this, oh boy, we're relieved, let's throw it off. It was something that people tried to hold on to, but they were oppressed until it was pulled away. Some of the others, before we move on to a couple other books you have here to talk about, Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier you've got there, Charles Borromeo, St. Teresa of Avila. I mean, what's she doing over in Spain? I thought Spain was okay.
Well, you know, I mean, the problem is, of course, that, that wherever there are human beings, there's sin. And Spain was beset by wars, about the wars between France and Spain and the various regions of Spain. And also
the Moors, obviously.
And the Moors, obviously, had only just been removed from Spain relatively recently.
1492, basically, around Columbus.
And they were still being threatened. I say we had the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So. And then we had the corruption within the church. So what St. Teresa of Avila did, and I think this is very inspirational
And John of the
for us.
Cross, which you have here too.
Exactly.
Right?
What she did was to show that the answer to worldliness is not to follow the world, but to actually become more rigorous and vigorous in our practice of the faith. So their reform was a reform in the direction of more prayer, more austerity, and not to, if you like, which is a tendency sometimes, I think, with religious orders, we've seen this, you know, to try to follow the fads and fashions of the world. Once you start doing that, vocations dry up and the whole thing collapses.
That sounds familiar. Heroes of the Catholic Reformation, saints who renewed the church. Joe Pearce, let's talk quick about a couple of other books you brought with you. This is Death Comes for the War Poets, a verse tapestry woven for dramatic and narrative effect by Joseph Pearce, featuring the works of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. Who are those two people? And this is actually like a play. Tell me about it.
Yes, basically, Siegfried Sassoon is a literary convert, a convert to the Catholic faith. He's been a great favourite of mine. He's a poet. Best known for his war poetry from World War I. It's been a favourite of mine for years, and I've always wanted to write his biography. It's been on my list. I never got round to it. And then this sort of play sort of came to me, and it's basically a play about Siegfried Sassoon's life and conversion to the Catholic faith. So it begins during World War I. And the third character, apart from the two poets, is a female spirit called Death, which gives the whole play a sort of metaphysical memento mori, reminder of death aspect. And it ran for 3 weeks in New York, off Broadway in New York, and was, to my surprise, to actually very good reviews, because I thought because it's so Catholic that it would be crucified by the secular media there, but it wasn't, surprisingly.
Right. Now, why is death important? Obviously, you're dealing actually, if you know about the World War I and the lost generation, and in this case, Wilfred Owen doesn't make it.
Right.
Sassoon's the one who goes on. And you talk about the four last things being important and death tying into that. Why is that it's so important for a Catholic to focus on death, you'd say, well, shouldn't it be on life?
Yeah, well, I think that the glory of the play, if you like, it's about two conversion stories, the conversion of Siegfried Sassoon, but also the conversion of death. Because at the beginning of the play, when we're seeing death through the eyes of the secular understanding of life, she's like a witch or a hag from Macbeth. But as Sassoon grows in faith, and moves towards Catholicism, death herself is converted. So that death becomes something which is glorious and welcoming and unthreatening, because as long as we're in a state of grace, of course, it's our doorway to heaven. So what I find more dynamic about it than Sassoon's own conversion is the conversion of death.
Okay. And when did that come to you? Was that something that you took by reading their verse, by reading their poetry, and you saw that and you brought it together? Where did that idea come to you?
I've known their poetry, and there's also other poets such as Chesterton and others, Hopkins, Eliot, that are in the play. But the actual play itself came as a gift, and I don't want to sound sort of as if I'm going for some ecstasy here, but honestly, the whole thing poured out of me in about 3 hours one evening, and just need tweaking after that. It was given to me as a work of art, and that only happened a handful of times in my life, and I'm very grateful for it.
Very good, and we are too. Death Comes for the War Poets, verse tapestry. Let's talk just very quickly about a biography that you did on Tom Monaghan, Monaghan, A Life, and it says here in the beginning, you say, there are, however, parallels between my position as Tom Monaghan's biographer and Raymond Arroyo's position as the biographer of Mother Angelica. Though we both had a business relationship with our subject, we were both intent on preventing that fact from clouding our view and our judgment. And we were both aware that our subject did not want sugarcoating and desired honesty. Like Raymond, I have written a book that does not avoid controversy or seeming contradictions inherent in my subject's character, the quiet and somewhat shy and introverted man who founded and owned Domino's Pizza, that's what people should know, and also who bought the Detroit Tigers. That's the first time I dealt with them when I was working in sports, that they were owning the Detroit Tigers. The independent innovator who is derided as a rigid conservative, the ascetic pursuer of the simple life who was notorious for splurge spending on fast cars, airplanes, and boats. The billionaire desires to give his fortune away. What the world will see as a sign of a mass of contradictions.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm always minded, being a Chestertonian, of a contradiction might be a paradox. In other words, two apparent contradictions point to a deeper truth. And I was certainly struck. I'm not suggesting in the biography that Tom Monaghan is a saint in the way that Mother Angelica might be seen as a saint. But I did see a parallel between that Raymond had to make sure that he was going to try as far as possible to be objective, even though he was invested in terms that he knew the subject. Same with me with Tom Monaghan, and with me, quite frankly, it's more of a conflict, because I have had good experiences with Tom Monaghan, and there's some things I'm very grateful for, but I've had bad experiences with him because I was very heavily involved with RMU University for 11 years, and there's all sorts of conflicts going on in the background there. But I had to, if you like, try to subdue that, keep that under control, so I could write an honest, objective life of the man.
And did they have the sign off? Did he sign
This
off?
particular book was actually commissioned to me, by Tom Monaghan.
I see.
First time ever, and that's why I made it perfectly clear to him. Well, you know, it can't be a hagiography, because no one will take it seriously, and nobody will take me seriously. So he agreed to that, and so he's taken the criticisms on the nose, on the chin. But I think that the overall, he's a man who's trying to live his faith in spite of all of his weaknesses, and that really makes him like the rest of us.
Right, exactly, as it's revealed to him as well. Another book in the works?
I've got a book coming out called Narnia for grown-ups later this year, so that I'm excited about that. It's looking at the deeper theological, philosophical elements of the Chronicles of Narnia.
There's deeper things underneath than just a wonderful story?
Oh, you bet.
Oh, they are. Okay, well, Joe Pearce, we'll look for you to bring those out as only you can. Thank you so much for all your fine work here over the years at EWTN, the series, including the Tolkien, Discovering Tolkien, your work on that, and these wonderful books. Our friend Joe Pearce, author of several books. The most important one is Heroes of the Catholic Reformation, Saints Who Renewed the Church, available through our religious catalog, and Death Comes for the War Poets as well. And finally, the biography of Tom Monaghan, a very interesting Catholic, all available through EWTN's religious catalog. Thank you so much for joining us right here on EWTN's Bookmark. We'll see you next time.